Well, hello there. Today we're going to put in dialogue an Islamic view of God with a Christian view of God. It's well known that Islam raises the strongest objections to a Christian view of God as a trinity of persons. But both are monotheistic faiths, and so the key issue comes down to how each religion articulates the oneness of God. It's important that I define what we're trying to accomplish here. First of all, I want to accomplish a better understanding between the two religious traditions. And secondly, speaking as a Christian, I want to encourage Christians to think more deeply about the reality of God as Trinity in light of the Islamic critiques about God as triune. Let's start out with a bit of background about how Muslims understand Allah. And what we'll see is that their understanding of Allah is very close to a Christian understanding of Yahweh. Muslims would emphasize first, as Christians do, that God is the creator and origin of everything. Creation ex nihilo is an important doctrine both to Muslims and to Christians. And that God sovereignly guides all things toward the end that he desires. So creation is completely by God, and creation has a purpose in God. And so Muslims, like Christians, have to emphasize two things at once: God's omnipotence and God's benevolence. God is all powerful and God is all good. Both Christians and Muslims affirm that. Also, then, Christians and Muslims together have to affirm that God is just and that God is merciful. And they understand justice and mercy as two aspects of God's eternal being. Now, this also means that Christians and Muslims have to balance somehow a relationship between human free will and God's sovereign predestination of all things. God is, in fact, sovereign. All things work according to God's plan, but somehow human beings are responsible for their actions before God. The big difference between Christianity and Islam that becomes almost immediately apparent is that in Islam, there is no formal doctrine of original sin as there is in Christianity. Christians understand all human beings to be fallen and therefore without God's grace to be unable to please God. Well, Muslims don't have that doctrine, and so there will be some differences that emerge from that point. Furthermore, there is great similarity in the way that Christians and Muslims articulate God's attributes. The attributes are roughly the same in Christian tradition as they are in Islamic tradition. So Christians have traditionally held to a doctrine of God's simplicity. God is not composed of parts. God is the first cause, and so he's not composed of parts. God is pure act. There's no potentiality in God. God is to the fullest everything that God is. And God is a whole in all things that God does. And so whatever God does, all of God does that. And so this is the classic doctrine of simplicity as Christians have understood it. Now, Muslims argue kind of in the same way. Everything other than Allah is, they say, when considered in and by itself, pure not being. Now, what they're getting at is that Allah alone is being. This is very close to what Christians understand by God as pure act. His existence is his essence, Christians would say. And Muslims are saying that creation, by contrast, is pure not being. So the God aspect is the sole thing in existence. And Christians also would say that God is, and that's the fundamental reality, that there is creation is contingent, and creation doesn't add anything to God. Furthermore, Muslims will affirm that Allah is too absolutely great to be called greater or most great by way of relation or comparison. Now, Christians also emphasize that even our best language about God is through analogy, and with analogy, there's always greater dissimilarity than similarity, says the Fourth Lateran Council. And so Muslims are emphasizing something that's very close to what Christians are emphasizing in God's holiness. God is wholly other. He's completely other than his creation. He's set apart and absolute in a way that creation is merely contingent. And we can't express God's greatness by way of relation to creation. We simply say that God is ultimate reality and creation is contingent. God, Allah, is too great for anyone, whether prophet or angel, to grasp the real nature of his greatness. No one has seen God at any time. God's essence is off limits to being seen by human eyes. It's simply too great for us. So much that God transcends all relations, because to bear relationship to what is imperfect carries with it imperfection. Muslims will say that God is relational and God can be relational. And I think there's something very close here to what traditionally Christians have emphasized in saying that God is immutable and God is impassible. That is, in saying God is impassible, that God is not affected by God's creation. God may choose to suffer with creation, have emotions. Certainly God has them, but he does not be affected by his creation. In the same way, God is not changed in his nature by creation. Creation doesn't have some kind of hold on God that changes his very being. And so, classically, Christians and Muslims are agreed on these essential attributes of God. It's usually Surah 59 that Muslims go to articulate the attributes of God most clearly. Here we see Allah being the knower of everything seen and unseen. He's the most compassionate, the most merciful. There is no God like him. He's the king. He's most holy, all perfect, the source of all peace, the watcher of all, the almighty, the supreme in might, the majestic. And he's the creator, the inventor, the shaper. He has the beautiful names, the 99 beautiful names. He is the Almighty and the All-Wise. We see here a list of attributes that are very similar to Christian attributes about God. And the medieval theologian Al-Ghazali articulates from this surah that God has 4 properties that are part of his essence. God's existence is his essence. God's eternality is his essence. God's unity is his essence. And God's knowability is his essence. Christians will hold to all of those as well, with a special emphasis on knowability. And here, much of the discussion between Islam and Christianity will occur, and so I'll come back to the knowability of God in a bit. Of course, it's in the issue of unity and triunity that the real difference between Muslims and Christians stands, and it's where the real debates lie. Now, it's important as we begin to approach this issue that we articulate some misconceptions that Muslims may have about Christians at this point, because I think there are some that have been noted, and I think it's important that we articulate those and bring them out so that we can deal with them fairly. Miroslav Volf says, what the Quran denies about God as the Holy Trinity has also been denied by every great teacher in the church in the past and ought to be denied by every Orthodox Christian today. In other words, everything that the Quran and Muslim tradition denies about God as Trinity is also denied by Christian theologians. And so what Wolf is saying is that there's a lot of misconceptions that form the debates rather than moving beyond those misconceptions. I'll name 3 misconceptions that are important for today. First of all, what is the Trinity? Muslims seem to understand the Trinity in places as being the Father, Mary, and Jesus. Secondly, how do Muslims understand God having a son? Often it is articulated in ways that are adoptionistic and Arian. And furthermore, what do we do with the charge of tritheism? So first, what do Muslims understand as Trinity based on the Quran? Well, here's Surah 5. It says, and behold, Allah will say to Jesus, O Jesus, son of Mary, did you say to men, take me and my mother for 2 gods besides Allah? And Jesus will say, glory to thee. Never could I say what I had no right to say. Had I said such a thing, thou wouldst have indeed known it. Thou knowest what is in my heart, though I know not what is in thine. For thou knowest in full all that is hidden. Now, what we see here is that the Quran seems to be envisioning that Christians hold that Allah and Mary and Jesus are what Christians understand to be the triune persons. Now, perhaps Muhammad had some poor information here. Perhaps he had become familiar with a heterodox group of Christians who believed something like that. But clearly, Christian faith has never held that, and so this would be a misconception. Maybe the clearest misconception has to do with Allah taking a son. And the Quran is very clear in many places, praise to God who did not take up a son, said many times. But as we look more carefully, what we see is that Christians have also condemned that language of God taking up a son. And they say, apparently Christians are saying, the most merciful has taken for himself a son. You Christians have done an atrocious thing. Well, yes, if that's what Christians are saying, then they have done an atrocious thing, because Christians have never believed that God took a son. Rather, Father and Son are eternally in relationship with each other because both are fully and absolutely God. The church itself condemned this heresy as the heresy of adoptionism in the year 267 in the Synod of Antioch. Paul of Samosata was teaching that God took Jesus Christ, a human person, and adopted him as his son at the baptism. And the council was very clear that this language must be condemned. God does not take a son. The father-son relationship is an eternal kind of a relationship. It doesn't begin to occur in time. So further, it's not appropriate for the Most High that he should take a son. Absolutely, it's not appropriate that the Father should take a son, because the very fact that he's Father is an eternal name for Christians, meaning that the Son is an eternal relation. The Son has always existed in relation to the Father, and the Father has always existed in relation to the Son. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, also implied here in the Quran is an Arian heresy that Muslims apparently think Christians are making. So he is Allah, the one and only, Allah, the eternal, the absolute. He begets not, nor is he begotten. Now, Christians would say there is a begotten relationship between son and father. But notice what the Muslims are implying here, that this began in history, that the father at a certain point took a son. Now, this is exactly Arius's reading of the word begotten, that the Father must be greater than the Son. In fact, only the Father can be God and the Son must be a creature, because the Father existed before the Son. A father who begets a son must have existed before the Son. The church condemned that view in the year 325 at the Council of Nicaea. It said, no, the father-son relationship is an eternal one. Like begets like. Father begets a son. If both father and son are God, then both father and son are eternal. That relationship has to be an eternal one. God did not take a son in any way. Rather, God has always been father-son in relationship to each other. Furthermore, there's a misunderstanding in the way that tritheism is attributed to Christians. Notice Surah chapter 4, say not three, desist in saying three. It will be better for you, for Allah is one God, glory be to him. Well, true. Christians have always affirmed the same. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. Jesus himself says, Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And that's the first commandment. Jesus never claims there are two, and in the sense of being differentiated from each other. Rather, he claims there is one God. And so Muslims and Christians are in agreement on the fact that there is one God. Christians have always emphasized the unity of this one God. They are thoroughly monotheistic. Pannenberg's quote is helpful here. Beyond the unity, no more can be said about God. Thus, the doctrine of the Trinity is in fact concrete monotheism, in contrast to the notions of an abstract transcendence in the one God and abstract notions of a divine unity that leaves no place for plurality. Christians and Muslims are fully agreed, Pannenberg is saying, that God is one. This is concrete monotheism, though, to accept a plurality in that oneness, to accept a complexity in that oneness, if God is in fact greater than us, and God has revealed himself that way. Now, Christians have always emphasized the unity of the one essence in God, that all of the persons are his essence, and that God is simple being, not composed of parts. And they've done it in three ways. First of all, they've always emphasized mutually inseparable operations. In God, wherever God is working beyond himself, all persons of the Trinity are always doing the same operation. Yes, we attribute to the Son certain things, we attribute to the Spirit certain things, we attribute to the Father certain things, but all persons of the Trinity are always involved in all the works of God beyond himself. Furthermore, the doctrine of perichoresis emphasizes the unity in God. Each of the persons is fully in the others. There's no independence of one person against another. They're not somehow this God and that God. They are together, always in one another, always of that same essence, distinguished as persons by their relations of origin, but always one together. I am in the Father, and the Father is in me, and the divine persons are always in one another. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, Christians have always emphasized one divine intellect and one divine will. There are some Christians today that disagree with this, but traditionally, this has been very important for safeguarding the unity of God, that all persons share or have together or have in full that same intellect in God. There is one intellect in him. Now, this doesn't mean that the persons are less personal because they have together that one intellect. Rather, it means that God's intellect is different than ours. God's intellect is absolute. God knows all things from all time. And so it's not as if the persons of the Trinity need to collaborate and come to a decision and think through things and help each other. Rather, the fullness of the divine intellect is possessed by each person of the Trinity. We could say the same thing and must say the same thing about the one will of God. Each of the persons possesses in full that one will. So the persons of the Trinity are not thinking different things and doing different things and then come to a common conclusion at the end of it. Rather, they always, forever, have had the same will together. And Christians emphasize that unity amongst the persons in that way. It seems that if Christians were able to articulate these doctrines more clearly, and Muslims were to wrestle with these doctrines more deeply, that there could be a lot more common ground reached on the real nature of this one God. Now, most important for dialogue is to recognize that actually Christians and Muslims share a common theological dilemma, a common issue that has to be worked out. And that is, what is the relationship between God and God as he is known to us on earth, or God in himself and God's word to us? Christians state the problem clearly in John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning, and the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. God has a self-expression, and that self-expression is an eternal self-expression, and that self-expression takes a form that human beings are able to understand it. Here it's the person of the Word, this Jesus Christ. Interestingly, Muslims have exactly the same issue and have had to work through exactly the same process. That God's self-revelation in the Quran seems to be God's very self-revelation and therefore eternal, but also it came to existence in a certain time in a human form which humans could understand in Arabic. How to resolve this dilemma takes them very close to the Christian dilemma of talking about one God, but God and his word being differentiated. So in Muslim tradition, there was a group called the Asharites who considered the speaking contingent because it obviously had happened in time. So the Quran is an extension of God, not really part of God's being itself, but more like God's extension of power, God's extension of his words. But Ibn Hannibal, that key medieval thinker, emphasized that God's speech, the Quran, must be God's eternal being itself. Because the Quran is God's word and God has an eternal word, that this word must be God's eternal being. And so he would emphasize that God's eternal word became a human word at a particular point in time. Now, if we take that word imagery seriously that both Muslims and Christians have to deal with, what we see is that both are wrestling with the same issue. For Christians, God's word became flesh. The fundamental revelation of God is Jesus Christ. Christians are the people of a person, not the people of a book, in quite the same way that Muslims are people of a book. For them, God's word took shape in the Quran, in Arabic words that are understandable to people who read Arabic. And so that is God's word, and God's word in extended form in our human reality. Notice then that both Muslims and Christians are dealing with a very similar reality, a very similar theological problem. There is, in a sense, differentiation in God. God and his word are two distinguishable things, but not separate from each other, and really one together. And I think if Muslims and Christians both push further into this dialogue and this place for discussion, that the conversations could go a little deeper and that more common ground could be found. Well, finally then, what can we expect to get out of such dialogue? Where might it go? And I think the Jewish scholar John Levinson puts this well. He says in the last analysis, the Christian and the Muslim conceptions of the one God have enough in common to make a productive comparison possible. But as in any responsible comparison, the contrasts must not be sugared over. There's still two different religions. They're still different from one another. But there may be points of contact that could be explored a bit more, and that commonality could be found, and that this could lead toward mutual dialogue that would enliven and enrich both traditions. Secondly, I think the destroying of misconceptions is an important part of the dialogue. Christian tradition does, we see, avoid most of the problems that Islamic theology attributes to it. Islamic theology does misunderstand a number of ways that the Christians actually understand the Trinity. Now, certainly there are Christian misconceptions of Islam, and sometimes those misconceptions are willful, and both sides ought to work against misconceptions and to really understand the other tradition as it officially understands itself. Finally, we could say that dialogue and discussion and mutual understanding really are requirements for love. And as persons required to love one another, persons required to reach out to one another in love, there's something responsible and required in our Christian faith, perhaps also in the Muslim faith, about reaching out to one another and attempting to understand each other, being in patient, careful dialogue with each other that could be mutually beneficial. We close with a very helpful statement, a very seed form kind of statement about dialogue between Muslims and Christians, but it does provide some steps toward a way forward. This is Nostra Aetate from the Vatican II Council, official Catholic theology. The Church regards with esteem also the Muslims. They adore the one God who lives and subsists in himself. merciful and all-powerful, the creator of heaven and earth, who has spoken to men. They recognize the similarity in attributes of God. They take pains to submit wholeheartedly even to his inscrutable decrees, just as Abraham, with whom the faith of Islam takes pleasure in linking itself, submitted to God. And although, notice now there's a contrast, although they do not acknowledge Jesus as God, they revere him as a prophet. They also honor Mary, his virgin mother, and at times they even call on her with devotion. There's room for dialogue. There's room to talk.